Iran thought missiles and drones would be enough. 47 years of revolutionary speeches. 47 years of telling its own people that their sacrificed economy was for a greater cause. 47 years of telling the whole world that nothing from the outside could break the Islamic Republic. And then, in just 18 days, a United States naval blockade did what decades of sanctions, trade bans, and United Nations resolutions could never do. It found the one weak spot that the regime had absolutely no answer for. Not the missiles, not the nuclear program, not the network of armed groups stretching from Beirut to Sana'a, the oil, the lifeline, the single source of money that pays for everything else. And now Iran is raising what looks very much like a white flag. Not in the language of formal surrender, but in the language of numbers, in the language of tankers sitting still, in the language of a president begging his own people to turn on 2 lights instead of 10. This is Professor John. The story of Iran's energy collapse is the most important economic story of this entire conflict. And it is happening right now, in real time, with a precision that every spy agency, every oil market, and every government on earth is watching at the same moment. I want to give you the complete picture, every confirmed number, every mechanism, every timeline, every consequence, because the numbers behind this collapse are more alarming than any military threat either side has made out loud. Subscribe now, because what is happening to Iran's oil infrastructure right now cannot be undone by diplomacy. The damage being done in these days is permanent in ways that the bombs were not. Start with a number that the maritime intelligence firm Kepler published this week, a number that Bloomberg, Al Jazeera, Business Standard, and every serious energy publication in the world immediately picked up and ran. Iran has between 12 and 22 days of unused crude oil storage space remaining. That is it. 12 to 22 days before the tanks are completely full, before the oil has absolutely nowhere left to go, before the wells that are still pumping oil into a system with no way out must be shut down entirely. Kepler is not a company that exaggerates. They are the firm whose satellite technology tracks every single tanker moving across every ocean on the planet. Their analysts can see directly into Iran's storage tanks and loading docks. When Kepler says 12 to 22 days, they're reading the actual fill levels of actual tanks. The mechanism that created this crisis can be explained in just 3 numbers. And those 3 numbers tell the whole story. In March 2026, Iran was exporting 1,850,000 barrels of crude oil every single day. After the United States naval blockade began on April 13th, that number crashed to 567,000 barrels per day by late April. That is a collapse of approximately 70%. And during that same period, Goldman Sachs estimated that Iran had already been forced to cut as much as 2.5 million barrels of daily crude production. The oil is still being pumped out of the ground at reduced but still significant rates, flowing into storage facilities that were never designed to act as permanent holding tanks, because they were always designed to flow directly onto tankers and out to customers. The tankers are blocked. The storage is filling up. The wells are still running. The math leads to one result: 12 to 22 days until the entire system seizes up and stops. Kepler's senior analysts have put a specific number on what happens next. If the blockade continues past the storage capacity deadline, Iran could be forced to cut another 1.5 million barrels per day of production by mid-year. Add that to the 2.5 million already cut according to Goldman Sachs' estimate, and Iran is facing a situation where its total oil output falls to somewhere between 1.2 and 1.3 million barrels per day. Before this war, Iran was producing around 3.3 million barrels per day. That is a 60% reduction in the productive output of one of the largest oil reserve holders on the entire planet. And it was not achieved by bombing oil fields. It was achieved by blocking the ports through which the oil has to leave. But here is the part of this collapse that most news coverage is not giving enough attention. The permanent part, the difference that United States Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent was pointing at when he used the specific word fragile to describe Iranian oil wells in petroleum engineering, when a producing well is forced to shut down under emergency conditions instead of through a carefully planned process. Something happens inside the ground below. The water layer beneath the oil column, which had been held in place by the pressure of the reservoir, begins to move upward into the area where oil is produced. This process is called water coning, and it cannot be reversed. When the well is reopened, it no longer produces just oil. It produces increasing amounts of water mixed in, permanently reducing how much oil that well can ever produce again. The Foundation for Defense of Democracies estimates the permanent production loss from a forced mass shutdown at 300,000 to 500,000 barrels per day. Not temporary, permanent. $9 to $15 billion per year, every year after this, permanently subtracted from whatever Iran's financial picture looks like after the conflict ends. This is the disaster that Bezan's statements have been quietly pointing toward, and that the Kepler data is now making completely real. The diplomatic conversations happening right now about reopening the Strait of Hormuz are being held as if a deal signed tomorrow would restore Iran's oil industry tomorrow. It would not. The damage piling up right now inside Iran's underground reservoirs will not be fixed by any document signed in any hotel in Islamabad. The Chabahar dimension is where the story moves from crisis to something closer to total catastrophe for Iran's strategic position. Chabahar port, located on Iran's southeastern coast along the Gulf of Oman, was supposed to be Iran's backup plan, the road that goes around the Strait of Hormuz entirely. The port that India spent years building up, the gateway to the international north-south transport corridor supported by both China and Russia, the asset that Iran pointed to whenever analysts asked what happens if Hormuz gets blocked. Now look at Chabahar today. On a normal day, 5 ships would be docked there. Today, more than 20 tankers and cargo vessels sit jammed and waiting, a number confirmed across multiple reporting outlets. Because the United States Navy does not only enforce its blockade in the Strait of Hormuz, it enforces it in the Gulf of Oman, in the Arabian Sea, in the Bay of Bengal, in the Indian Ocean between Sri Lanka and Indonesia. Every Iran-linked vessel in every ocean is a potential target. Chabahar sits in the Gulf of Oman. The Gulf of Oman is where the USS Spruance fired 3 rounds into the engine room of the Tuscan on April 19th. Plan B is now a parking lot of stranded ships. The India element makes this even worse by an enormous degree. India's investment in Chabahar was the geopolitical reason the port mattered strategically at all. Indian infrastructure, Indian money. India's interest in connecting to Central Asian trade routes to Iran. That investment has now stalled, confirmed in reporting. India has signed a new contract with the UAE's Fujairah port infrastructure, shifting its operational focus to a facility that bypasses Iran completely. Iran is not just losing a port, it is losing the country whose involvement gave that port its strategic meaning. Even Iran's partners are now calculating that the cost of being connected to Chabahar is higher than whatever access it was supposed to provide. And then there is the UAE decision that hit Iran harder than any single development since the blockade began. The United Arab Emirates left OPEC, not quietly, not with apologies. The UAE Energy Minister, Suhail al-Mazrouei, told CNN directly that the timing was right because the Strait of Hormuz is closed and the impact on the market would be limited. He said it out loud. He connected the exit explicitly to the Hormuz closure. The UAE is leaving OPEC because the closing of the strait created the exact window where its exit costs the least and delivers the greatest strategic benefit. The Habshan-Fujairah pipeline, 380 kilometers of infrastructure, connecting Abu Dhabi's inland oil fields directly to the Gulf of Oman without passing through Hormuz at all, is the physical proof of why the UAE's departure from OPEC is so devastating to Iran's energy strategy. Since March 2026, exports through Fujairah have surged by 57%. The pipeline is currently moving approximately 1.9 million barrels per day. By leaving OPEC, the UAE is freed from the production limits that the cartel sets, and it could increase that flow by up to an additional 1 million barrels per day, without needing anyone else's permission. This is not the UAE being aggressive toward Iran. This is the UAE doing exactly what every sovereign energy producer does. It is maximizing its position in a market where its main competitor has been knocked out of effective competition. Iran's Hormuz leverage card was built on the assumption that the world would have no alternative supply route when Hormuz was closed. The Fujairah pipeline running near full capacity is the alternative supply route that is proving that assumption completely false in real time. OPEC's share of global supply control has dropped from 30% to 26% as a direct result of the UAE's departure. For Iran, that number is catastrophic. Not because Iran needs OPEC's institutional structure for its own exports, which have already been sanctioned for years, but because OPEC's production discipline was one of the tools keeping oil prices high enough that Iran's heavily discounted sanctioned export oil still generated meaningful cash. When prices are high, selling Iranian crude at a $30 discount to the benchmark price still produces real money. When the UAE's extra million barrels per day pushes prices down, while Iran's export volume has already collapsed by 70%, the combination is what the math of energy economics calls a two-front loss. Volume is down, price is falling, revenue is approaching zero. The document that may be the single most alarming piece of intelligence about Iran's internal condition was leaked by Iran International on April 27th, and it needs to be read carefully. The Supreme National Security Council, chaired by Zulqadar, the hardline IRGC figure installed over President Pezeshkian's objection, met on an emergency basis and reached three conclusions. First, protests could break out again within days, with economic pressure already acting as the main trigger. Second, the regime can survive the blockade for at most 6 to 8 weeks from the date of the meeting. Third, by the end of spring, approximately 2 million jobs could disappear from the private sector. Security officials summarized the overall picture in a single sentence whose directness is remarkable even by the standards of internal government documents. Unrest is inevitable. Only its timing is uncertain. Read that again. The Supreme National Security Council of the Islamic Republic of Iran, the body that coordinates the regime's most sensitive security decisions, has written in an official document that unrest is coming. And the only question is when. This is not an analysis from the opposition. This is not a United States intelligence assessment. This is the regime's own security apparatus writing in official language that the social contract between the government and its people is dissolving, and that the countdown to that dissolution is measured in weeks. The internet shutdown that has now run for 62 consecutive days, one of the longest national internet blackouts in the history of the internet according to confirmed CBS News reporting, is both a sign of that collapse and something that is making it worse. 90 million Iranians cut off from the global digital economy. Online businesses in fashion, fitness, advertising, and retail have watched their income vanish. The shutdown was imposed as a wartime security measure, but it is destroying the digital economic layer that an entire generation of young Iranians built specifically to survive the physical economic damage of the sanctions era. The regime has shut down the internet. It cannot shut down the consequences of having done so. President Pezeshkian's national television address on April 25th is the human face of what the Supreme National Security Council described in cold official language. He told the Iranian people to turn on 2 lights instead of 10. Government offices are running on half-day schedules. Street lights have been cut by half in Isfahan and Tehran. The Tehran metro's heating has been reduced and cut repeatedly. The price of imported medicine has risen by 60%. Lines for bread, meat, and milk are growing longer in cities that had not seen food queues like this since the 1980s war with Iraq. Iran produces 1,850,000 barrels of crude oil per day under normal conditions. It can no longer find a route through which to sell any of it. And its president is asking citizens to use fewer lights. The proxy network dimension is where the financial collapse stretches from a domestic crisis into a strategic collapse at the same time. Every part of Iran's regional influence requires money. Hezbollah's salaries, Houthi drone production, Iraqi Shia militia operational budgets, Syrian logistics networks. All of it funded from the oil revenue that the blockade has reduced by 70%. Reports confirm that Hezbollah has reached the point of being unable to pay regular salaries. Houthi forces in Yemen are operating on depleted drone stockpiles with no confirmed resupply coming. Iraqi Shia militias have pulled back from field operations because no funding has arrived. The proxy war network that the IRGC spent 40 years and hundreds of billions of dollars building is being financially dismantled. Not by military strikes against those groups directly, by a naval blockade that cut the treasury off from the entire network all at once. A White House official confirmed to CNBC that Iran is losing $500 million per day because of the blockade. $500 million per day, $15 billion per month. The IRGC cannot maintain its own payroll, fund its proxy network, pay its security forces, subsidize the consumer goods that keep the social contract from collapsing, and finance the missile and drone programs that form its military deterrent, all at the same time on revenues that have already fallen 70% from already sanctioned levels. Iran is now reactivating 30-year-old scrap tankers as floating oil storage. The Nasha, an aging vessel that by any reasonable commercial logic should be sitting in a shipbreaker's yard in Bangladesh, has been brought back into service just to hold crude oil that has nowhere else to go. When a country starts using ships that were headed for the scrapyard as overflow storage for its most important export, the physical reality of economic desperation has no diplomatic language left to soften it. 3 scenarios remain, and each one is more consequential than the last. Iran backs down on the nuclear question and agrees to the comprehensive deal that President Trump's 5 red lines require. It resists. The Supreme National Security Council's internal timeline of 6 to 8 weeks expires, and the streets produce the unrest that the regime's own Security Council has already described as inevitable. Or the conflict escalates into a third phase of military operations against infrastructure, something that both Treasury Secretary Bessant and President Trump have publicly described as the remaining pressure option. None of these scenarios produces a clean outcome. All of them produce consequences that the global economy, which is already pricing Brent crude oil above $110 per barrel, has not yet fully calculated. Iran hung itself with its own rope the moment it chose to close the Strait of Hormuz rather than protect its oil revenue. The strategy that was supposed to give it maximum leverage has instead produced maximum vulnerability. It cannot sell the oil that funds the military that is holding the strait closed. The IRGC is blocking the deal that would relieve the economic pressure that is destroying the IRGC's own financial base. The regime's own Security Council is writing what amounts to surrender documents dressed up as threat assessments. And somewhere in a secret location whose coordinates only the IRGC knows, a wounded supreme leader who has not spoken publicly in 62 days is the one person whose authorization could end all of it. The countdown is not a metaphor. It is 12 to 22 days of storage capacity ticking down in real time, 1 barrel at a time. This is Professor Jiang.